Chapter 5 I'll Tame Him. The roaming of the king was one of the events of the Northland. It had been interrupted by his care of Reddy in the little Sheep Creek Valley as a nursery, but now it broke out afresh with renewed vigor. For wherever the roar of the king was heard, always there was with it the musical bay of a hound. And where they hunted, there was once a scattering of the game and a general excitement among the other wolves in the vicinity, who seemed to gain in daring from the example and very presence of these two. They traveled the Athabasca forest from end to end, and made side trips east and west and to the north. Occasionally woodsmen would see them and take shots at one or both, but they were adept at dodging and were never hit. Nor were there any trappers who could catch or poison them. They seemed to bear charmed lives. Anyone who could have claimed that he'd disposed of one of this pair would have become something of a celebrity. Strangely enough, though, it was Reddy that was most talked of. He was news, for up to that time no one had ever seen a hound running with wolves. And Reddy did run with them. He'd gained such assurance and prowess that the wolves, especially the young ones, began to follow him just as they followed the king. They liked to be led when the hunting was difficult. The black leader had allowed no other wolf to take the lead over him, but he willingly followed Reddy, who developed more hunting ambition and speed than almost any wolf in the forest. The two remained inseparable, but the hound no longer needed very much protection. He often fought his own battles, if fighting was necessary, and some of these were terrible indeed. Fighting, however, became more and more seldom, as the wolves, wherever they went, grew to know and respect him. And he, growing more wolfish every day, learned how to avoid difficulties with them without losing face. One day in the spring the two returned to the little Sheep Creek Valley. Johnny heard them that first night as they charged along the mountainside in their hunting, and he noticed at once the change in Reddy's baying. It had become confident, determined. The musical note was still there, but it was shorter and firmer. Reddy had grown up. And if Johnny could have been with them that night, he would have seen something that would have surprised him, for the two ran several fierce-looking wolves, including the yellowish-gray male with a slight limp evident in a front leg, all glad now to follow Johnny's former pup in his hunting. When the chase led below the cabin, the three black and tans locked in their kennels began a great howling and sympathy. Not knowing anything about wolves, they just wanted to share in what sounded like a lot of fun and excitement. Instantly the noise of the pack stopped, and was not heard again for many a night. Anything that reminded the wolves of man's presence put a stop to their exuberance, and made them furtive and self-conscious, if not afraid. Not long after that night, Johnny received official instructions to kill the wild hound that was roaming in the woods, as well as any wolf that he found in his precinct. Reddy's fame was spreading. "It's a joke on you," was Mac's reaction to the words. "And a mighty unpleasant one, for I know you think a lot of that wild pup." "It's a joke on them," retorted Johnny, "for nothing can make me do it. Dogs might help to get 'em. What about that pack of hounds you got, to train to hunt wolves?" "Oh, that?" said the ranger. "It may take a long time to train young hounds." Mac laughed. He thought Johnny was stalling. "I don't blame you," he said finally. But Johnny had a plan. He knew considerable about hounds, and he figured that the black and tans, far from harming Reddy, might prove a means of reclaiming him from the wilds. He scarcely dared put much faith in the experiment, but the quiet way he entered upon it, by beginning the serious training of the black and tans. His first move was to secure a trapped coyote from the Indian village and keep it in a comfortable kennel at some distance from the cabin. He did not like the idea of trapping any creature, but he kept no traps. And here there was a need and an opportunity to give a trapped animal a chance for its life. The kennel was a runaway of woven wire and long and narrow. Each morning when he fed the coyote, he let loose the 3 hounds and took them down there. The little wolf was just about the size of a fox, an ill-tempered beast who knew it was safe with a fence around him, so he would growl at the hounds and run up and down the yard, sassing them, until he drove the high-spirited animals nearly frantic. The wild scent increased their excitement, and so did Johnny's urging. In a day or two, their chief aim in life was to get that coyote. Now the second phase of training began. One day, Johnny took the hounds down to the kennel on a leash. He opened the door of the yard and let the coyote bolt out in full view of the pups, who nearly turned somersaults in their frantic efforts to follow the hated little beast that was running from them to get away. Johnny, however, kept them waiting there excitedly until the coyote had 20-minute head start, and then he turned them loose. They dashed to the edge of the bushes where they had last viewed their enemy and began to hunt for him with their super keen noses. The scent was still there in his tracks, not very strong, but just enough to enable them to puzzle out the trail that he had taken, and it grew stronger and more thrilling the further they followed it. This was real hound work, and Johnny knew that after this, all they would need would be plenty of practice, and later on encouragement in following the timber wolves instead of the smaller variety. It was simply a matter of fostering their instinct and guiding it carefully toward the game they were desired to hunt. Hot on the coyote's trail, their fine voices echoed through the valley. Real music, hunters would have called the chorus. Reddy and King listened to it in their favorite spruce thicket and stood up when it came closer. The hound was strangely stirred and more drawn by the subtle call to join in on the glorious, exciting chase. The wolf, on the other hand, was bristling with his old hatred of man and man's accomplices. He knew only too well that they were dogs, even dogs like Johnny's, which he'd heard often around the cabin. There might be man or several men prepared to kill with their guns along with them. And hounds in particular, on account of their trailing abilities, meant danger to his kind. Safety lay in keeping hidden until they were gone, or until darkness made man blind. So when Reddy whined and walked about excitedly, he growled. And when Reddy made a start to leave the thicket, he sprang forward and placed his long body across the way, with such a rumbling in his throat that even his companion, who knew him so well, was surprised, and completely won to compliance with his warning. Thus it happened that Reddy's brother and 2 sisters passed within a little more than 100 yards of him, without an inkling of his presence, following the fast, wily coyote down the valley and into the great basin below where the thick high timber shut in all sounds of their baying. Johnny tried to follow them, but gave up, and impatiently waited through the long afternoon for their return to the cabin. When night came, he was still waiting. Reddy's excitement had not abated. No sooner had the shadows fallen than he was out of the thicket like a flash, racing to the line of the chase in order to study the tracks. The wolf and he puzzled the thing out together. They knew that Johnny's 3 hounds were following a coyote and that they had not returned. They found Johnny's tracks too, but noted that he'd turned and gone back toward his cabin. Then Reddy took to the trail as if it had been that of a buck. Nose close to the moist ground, he went along in leaps down the valley. And now he had an equally interested wolf at his heels. For several miles the trail was fairly straight, for the coyote was running to his distant home range, and then it began to twist and circle. There was evidence that the 3 hounds had been confused by these turns, for there were many places where they had separated and wandered about, as if hunting for the lost scent. Where they struck the swampy bank of the big Athabasca River, they seemed to have lost the coyote's tracks entirely. From that point, the trail was extremely confused, as if they were wandering aimlessly around the forest. Reddy was making circles in his attempts to find the trail where it left the maze, and a weird wail stopped him in his tracks. The wolf and he stood for some minutes trying to understand just what this meant and what had produced it. and then guardedly they headed in the direction from whence it had come. Suddenly the wolf gave a gruff signal to stop, for his ears had caught the sound of some animal following them. They leapt into the bushes and made their usual exploratory circle. Reddy turned left, and it was he who'd come upon the most miserable-looking creature he had ever seen. It limped first with one leg, and then the other, its tail between its legs, and its head hung down as it slunk through the woods half scared to death. It was black and tan, and one of his sisters. But this he could scarcely be expected to know. As he watched it, its nose went into the air, and the same wail that he'd heard before filled the quiet forest. The cry of a lonely, lost hound. He and the wolf approached it from opposite sides. It saw them, and for an instant seemed pathetically pleased, and then more miserably afraid than before. It dropped to the ground and groveled, whimpering shrilly as if it had been struck. Both the wolf and Reddy regarded it with utmost contempt, walking around it stiffly and aloof, as if it were contaminated. Seeing that it was not to be killed at once by these wonderful big animals, the black and tan took heart just enough to drag itself after Reddy, who quickly loped away from it. To be left here alone, however, was even more terrible to the poor thing at that moment, so it staggered to its feet and started after him. Reddy's whole training had been to avoid making friends with any animal, but something beyond his control forced him to turn around and allow the hound to catch up with him. This time they almost touched noses, and then Reddy was off again. But the lost hound still followed, and the longer Reddy saw this creature as his close kin, the more interested and tolerant he became. He forgot the wolf entirely, and covertly watched from the corners of his eyes every move of this new animal. A further complication came in the form of two more black and tans, which appeared from nowhere in particular, and looked just as low-spirited and forlorn as the first. These did not grovel at Reddy's feet, but followed him with hopeful, almost a worshipful manner, which again disarmed him and kept his mind in a whirl. They were not thinking any more of chasing coyotes. All they wanted was to be shown the way home to their kennel and their beds, where they'd always spent the night. The difference between these house-raised hounds and Reddy, who by this time had lived through a year in the woods, and in all weathers, was very marked. Reddy was much taller and much heavier, and his coat was thicker and glossier. When the snow had been deep on the ground, and an icy wind had swept down the valley, he had often come from the long hunt and burrowed under the snow to find warmth enough for a place to rest, while his sisters and brother had snuggled behind a hot stove. It was a wonder that he had survived, but nature had done her best to make up for generations of soft living behind him. In the cold season he'd grown almost 3 times the thickness of a coat of the ordinary pampered hound, and his blood circulation was so much better that he rarely shivered when the mercury went below 0. Now he was hard as nails and ready to hunt all night and part of the day if necessary. The 3 bedraggled black and tans stood in a lump and looked at him with sorrowful eyes. At one side, and very much aloof, sat the black wolf. He felt none of the responsibility that somehow had attached itself to Reddy. To the king, all of this was a meaningless waste of time. Now that the interest of the trailing hounds was past, there had been no exciting fight, this whole thing was boring to him. A diversion came when a young bull caribou passed between them and the river, his scent blowing in their direction. Both Reddy and the king instantly vanished like shadows and gave chase. This time there was no need to try any tricks. They simply rushed him to a standstill, and together pulled him down before he'd run a mile. Now they feasted. Reddy ate for a time and then looked about for the hounds, and then he stuffed down some more of the strength-giving meat and lay sprawled out near the scene, the wolf beside him. This time, no coyotes or other scavengers came to molest them. In the cool grayness of the morning, the king stood up to start the long trek to a higher and safer place in which to spend the day. But Reddy had the hounds on his mind. He wanted to see what they were doing. For almost the first time in their friendship, he refused to follow the old wolf, and instead took the back trail to where he'd left the three. And there he found them, curled up beside each other, shivering like aspen leaves. At his coming, they rolled their eyes in his direction, but did not move. Reddy walked around them and sniffed each one. They quickly raised their heads and began to show more life, for they smelled the caribou meat on his muzzle, and they were very hungry. Stiffly they got to their feet. Reddy started away from them, and they followed. Not knowing just what to do, Reddy led them to where he could find the king's trail, which was close to the remains of the caribou, and at the scent and sight of which the hounds, unaccustomed to such things, showed immediate interest. They walked around and around the carcass, but did not realize that they should eat any of it, and would have left it untouched if Reddy had not dropped down to finish gnawing on a bone he had hidden. This seemed to give them the same idea, for each hunted until other bones were found. After that, they felt differently about the caribou meat, and got to work in a big way, stuffing themselves until their lean bodies looked as if they had balloons inside of them. Now they had to rest some more, and at noon they were still resting. Reddy hung around, although very nervous about the possible danger. He listened intently to any alarm notes of the jays. The jays had discovered the meat and called loudly to all jays to come and carry it away for hidden storage in the trees. He kept his eye on the red squirrels when they appeared to be running away from anything, but the forest remained safe enough for all the morning, in spite of his fears, and he was beginning to be less watchful when all at once he heard the voice of man. Johnny was calling the hounds. He'd been riding all day and had reached the Athabasca, about half a mile below where Reddy was on guard. It took him some time to get much nearer because of the swamps, but soon even the jays were alarmed by the calls and sounds of the horses' feet. Reddy walked into the bushes, and the black and tans raised their heads sleepily, but did not even stand up. Reddy whined to warn them, and even ran past them in the manner of the wolf giving an alarm, but they took no notice. When Johnny's horse brought him up a game trail, and pricked its ears at the scent of the carcass, the ranger caught a quick glimpse of Reddy, and stood up in his stirrups to get a better view. Then he saw the black and tans nearby, and his heart began to beat faster, for at once he realized that his plan was already beginning to work, much sooner than he dared hope. He stopped the horse and waited, but Reddy did not appear again. In fact, he'd run as fast as he could up the valley. Johnny then came forward to greet the other hounds, and to look with an intense interest at the mixture of tracks remaining around the feast. "I'll tame him yet," he kept thinking jubilantly. End of chapter 5.